So doing business is a very useful tool, and it has been very visible, and you all know that it's one of the flagship reports of the World Bank, and it has been very useful in terms of initiating discussion of reforms. But what happened in the meantime is that it's also some kind of adverse effect, which is that governments started focusing so much on doing well in doing business that they sometimes oversee some other systemic issues around the business environment. For example, focusing on business entry reforms, they look at the steps and the days that the business takes to register and the costs for the business, which is kind of the front office perspective, but they forget about all the back office issues and how these institutions communicate. Is it a cost-effective model? So a lot of governments started reforming around the doing business indicators without being aware of the more systemic issues that they need to take into account when reforming. And that's how we wanted also to shift a little bit the focus from strictly doing business indicators to a little bit more systemic issues. And we started dealing a little bit more with also good regulatory practices, with transparency, with consultation, with regulatory impact assessment, with feedback mechanisms, all these instruments that can, let's say, make that can help the government obtain a more favorable business environment. We also started looking at more systemic ways of integrating government services. It means that we did a lot on simplifying the business environment in terms of procedures, as I mentioned, steps, days to register, focus on cost to businesses, but this has really not had much impact, for example, on formalization. And so we kind of started thinking about how to maybe focus on maybe some sectoral work, rather in addition to the horizontal cross-government reforms, how to also look at priority sectors for the country, and how to make sure that we also target those businesses that have the potential to grow. This is, I must say, of particular importance for developing countries, because there are implications that come out from the latest job studies that have been published in this area, which imply that there is an issue of stunted growth of businesses, meaning that the micro or small ones never get to grow to medium or large. They either die after 1 year, usually within the first year of operation, or they just never get to grow. Of course, most of them should not grow to be medium and or large, but if none of them grow, then that is a problem. And in developing countries, that is a huge problem. And we wanted to see how to tackle this area. And we realized that just simplifying business entry will not have much impact. And so we have a whole range of activities around targeting high growth businesses. We're trying also to experiment with some new approaches and kind of how to focus on specific sectors that are important for the country, which are competitive sectors, either from the perspective of strong domestic demand or export potential, and kind of trying to target those businesses that have the potential to grow. We're also looking a little bit more at the subnational reforms rather than just the national level, because it's a very important area for businesses, and even if you do tackle the constraints or the barriers at the national level, you are left with all the subnational municipal level, which has a whole range of different procedures for businesses, and which we have for some time maybe ignored, but now we're also going to be focusing on that. And then some new areas, such as, for example, this is one of the examples, the national quality infrastructure and standards, which are extremely important for businesses and for consumers as well, and are really of crucial importance for the business environment. This is a very complex area, and we're working on kind of trying to figure out what the approach should be to reforming a national quality infrastructure system. This is, of course, important also from the perspective of international trade and also harmonization with EU standards and all sorts of other issues. Now, I want to say a little bit about the doing business. And obviously you all know that Georgia is doing very well in doing business, and recently last year's report actually changed the way of ranking of countries, linking it to the distance to frontier, meaning that now the ranking of countries is linked to how well you're doing compared to the best. Let's say in starting a business, traditionally New Zealand is #1 because it takes half a day to register a business because everything is online. So you don't communicate with anyone, you just really, there are almost no formalities linked to registering a business in New Zealand. And so Georgia here is measured in starting a business with respect to how well is it doing compared to New Zealand. And as you see in all indicators, Georgia is doing fairly well, actually very well, except for resolving insolvency. So there seems to be a need to tackle this area. In other indicators, it is doing quite well. Now, I just wanted to say a little bit, I don't want to get into much detail, but just so that you're aware that doing business is changing as well. And it is changing actually because doing business is a very simple methodology, and that is really what, I mean, this is now my personal view. I think the main benefit of doing business is its simplicity, and that's why it has managed to have such a big impact, because it just allows you to compare countries in a very simple way, and this simple message enabled a lot of traction with politicians who then get excited if they're doing worse than the neighboring country, and then they want to do better. I know in my own country, in Serbia, at one point we were top reformer in the world. That was 10 years ago, and Croatia was doing not good at all. So this caused a lot of political traction, and the Prime Minister of Croatia wrote to the President of the World Bank complaining about the ranking, and it was the huge impact of the Doing Business report. In Africa, where I worked for 3 years, I must say that is one of the main entry points when it comes to do business environment reforms. Governments are very interested of doing well in doing business, and they compete with each other, and they really want to do well. You probably may or may not know that Rwanda has been among the top reformers in the world in the past 10 years, and after a period of severe problems, which we all know, they really made a big effort in terms of improving their business environment, and are doing pretty well in terms of these indicators. But this is of course not the whole story. So even in Rwanda, where they're doing extremely well in doing business indicators, they came back to us and they're saying, but we still don't have the level of investments which we expected. Why is that? We did so well in doing business, and we reformed, and we did everything you told us, but where are the investors? So this is not really the entire story. To go back to the formal issues, so the reason why doing business is changing is because of, let's say, the reviews that have been ongoing, and the criticism that it really does not reflect some important issues, some substantive issues, but rather gives a very narrow picture of the situation in the indicators, which it was not intended to do. But I think under this pressure, now doing business is changing and trying to introduce some more, let's say, meaningful indicators that would give more, let's say, qualitative also indicators rather than just quantitative of days, steps, or costs. And this is what is happening now, and you will see that several indicators have changed already in terms of some of them had major revisions, such as getting credit, protecting minority investors, and resolving insolvency. I mean, I guess this presentation will be shared with you, so I don't want to get into the detail of the methodology, but they were all, the main objective was to introduce more qualitative, let's say, measures rather than quantitative. There are changes which are going to happen this year as well, which are in these indicators. So in 5 of the indicators, they're going to add on complexity in the indicators, and this will somehow make it more difficult to, it's actually, on one side, it's very good because it does measure some of the qualitative issues. For example, in getting electricity, they added on the reliability of electricity supply, which I don't think it's a problem in Georgia, but in developing countries it's a huge problem. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the stability of the electricity is one of the main barriers for businesses. So once this is introduced, so the getting electricity indicator will also measure the power outages, the reliability of electricity. Africa will not do very well in this indicator for sure. So Again, my personal view is that this is kind of dangerous, also because it kind of doing business loses its simplicity. So adding on the distance to frontier means that developing countries, for them it will be much more difficult to have a good ranking compared to the best. And in this way they will somehow maybe lose incentives to even bother with doing anything around doing business indicators. And on the other hand, adding complexity again, it loses the simplicity for which it was known and well known and kind of very well used in terms of like initiating business environment reforms. Now, as you know, doing business is a report that is based on the input of the, let's say, users of the government services. So it actually has an incredible number of contributors to this report, who every year kind of provide input in terms of the procedures, the number of steps, the number of days, and that is how this data is compiled and then cross-checked with the government. And so there's a whole cycle here, which happens every year. I wanted just to point out to the main, let's say, main deadlines. Usually the questionnaire is sent December, January for the next cycle of the report. And as you see, it's a huge number. It's over 17,000 questionnaires that are sent out to the various countries. Then there is a kind of data verification collection, which occurs from February to May, and all the contributors provide the data. Then the data is analyzed, sent to the government. The government can also comment on the data and kind of correct whatever is they consider to be, or at least try to correct. There are also doing business teams that travel to various countries. By the way, I'm not a member of the doing business team, so and the cutoff date for the reforms is June 1st. So whatever is implemented by June 1st gets, let's say, recognized within the doing business report. And then there is the report production, publication, dissemination, and then the whole cycle is repeated all over again. We will see now how things will, let's say, develop once these indicators are now more complex. I mean, I must say it's in line with what we are thinking as well in my department, in the investment climate department. So doing business indicators are narrow, and you really need to have a broader focus on certain reforms rather than just looking at that. And this seems to be the direction in which the indicators are also being developed. Now, a thing which we have been thinking and working a lot on, it is actually, I must say, traditionally in the area of the OECD. So OECD has been working a lot on regulatory governance, regulatory reform, regulatory impact assessment. We have been kind of marginally involved in these themes, but have increasingly been so, especially thinking about OECD is typically focused on OECD member countries, so highly developed countries. We're thinking about how this agenda is relevant for developing countries, or countries that are reforming and that are, for example, in the, like Georgia, harmonizing their regulation with the EU, and how is this agenda relevant? Is it something which is just for highly developed countries? Because when we talk about regulatory impact assessment, if you look at it strictly speaking, only the US and the UK would fit the criteria to say, yes, they're doing proper impact assessment of their regulation. But is that the only issue, the only thing? Is regulatory impact assessment equal to cost-benefit analysis? I don't think so. I think there are many other benefits which can come out of transparency, consultation, and also using regulatory impact assessment in a kind of softer way to kind of make sure that there is some kind of evidence-based policy making. Now, I just gave some examples. There is really already a significant body of knowledge in terms of the impacts of regulatory practices and why is this important for the business environment. That has been a question, let's say, the burden of proof. Does regulatory reform, does, for example, regulatory impact assessment really work, is really a difficult question to answer. Very difficult. That's why it's probably so difficult to implement as well, because the benefits are not really obvious. And politicians like quick wins. That's why they like doing business. because it's black and white and they improve in the ranking. And in regulatory reform, regulatory governance, impact assessment, it's not that straightforward. It's a long-term commitment, and it's really not from today to tomorrow that results can be seen. But it is definitely obvious that if you systematically use regulatory impact assessment, if you consult, that this will have a positive impact in terms of the business environment quality and the predictability of business environment, which is very important for businesses. Now, I just wanted to make the point that this is really a recent agenda in the EU as well. Let's say, regulatory reform has traditionally been the agenda of the US and the UK and, let's say, common law-based countries. Within the European Union, this has become very much the focus of the attention in the past 15 years. Starting with the Mandelkern report, which was commissioned by the EU, and where a strong recommendation to focus on these issues has been given. So since 2001, this has constantly been on the agenda of the EU, gradually increasing in importance. So over the years, you will see that not only they were talking about it, but also acting. And so there was also a whole institutional structure around this. There was a better regulation strategy. An impact assessment board was established to kind of oversee the quality of legislation. Then there was a huge effort in reducing administrative burdens. So all these activities were happening in the past 10 years and continuing. So as for this year, what the EU did, they issued new, better regulation guidelines. And also I must say just about a little bit about how it developed. So it started with efforts to deregulate. So when it comes to the EU in particular, a lot of rules, as you all know, even now, proliferation of rules without much thinking whether they're necessary or not. So there was a clear necessity to kind of try and simplify this environment. That's why this whole effort started with deregulation. But then there was a realization, no, this is not enough. We really need to deal a little bit more with the quality. So this became better regulation rather than just deregulation. And then ultimately it was okay, but there are some other things as well. And we came down, like recently, to the smart regulation agenda at the EU level. And smart regulation agenda was very much focused on transparency. On transparency and on how to be inclusive, how to make sure that everyone has a say in the policy-making process, and how to be understandable to, and how to, let's say, present the policy materials and regulations in human language, let's say. So it's not enough anymore to publish the text of the law, because most people are not lawyers. They will not understand what is in there. So now the whole effort is really to make it, to present the objectives and the impacts in a comprehensive way. So you will see that openness and transparency is a huge thing on the EU agenda, and explaining better what the EU is doing and why. So they have an improved explanatory memorandum that accompanies each Commission proposal. Of course, a very intensive process of public consultation. Now we're coming to even like something, you know, if you kind of exaggerate in this, you can come to this, the new term is consultation fatigue. So, you know, you're kind of over-consulting, and so people get tired of it. And so it's also necessary to find a kind of balance in that. And they have a new refit activity, which means that, yes, they did deregulate, and they had the big kind of red tape reduction activity with the objective to reduce red tape by 25%. By, I think, 2012 was the cutoff date, but now they want to make sure that they don't add on again all these burdens that were cut off in these red tape reduction processes. And now, connecting to this EU agenda, a little bit more about transparency and consultation. Why I wanted to focus on this, I mentioned in the introduction, is because it seems to be a huge issue here. I mean, huge issue. It seems to be a big issue. It seems to be an issue on the private sector side. What my general feeling, my personal general feeling is, after having spent just a week here, so it might not be correct, is that the problem is, first of all, lack of trust between the government and the private sector on both sides. So the government doesn't trust that the private sector can provide any sort of qualitative input in the process, and the private sector doesn't trust the government. They think they're doing things behind closed doors and that they're hiding, and that consultation comes too late in the process. They're not able to provide any input. They find from one day to the other that laws have changed, and this is very bad for the business environment, because predictability is really one of the main preconditions for a good business environment. Throughout my career, I did a lot of consultation of businesses and a lot of focus groups around how to simplify the business environment. And when we had initiatives to, which I mentioned before, to cut days and steps, when you talk to businesses, what they tell you is, we really don't care if we can register in 2 days or 10 days or 20 days. We really care about predictability, so if it's 20 days, it has to be 20 days. And we also want to have access to information. So we want to know what is ahead in due time. We want to have like easily accessible information, downloadable forms, this and that. So this is what businesses care about, and this, as I said, seems to be a problem here, because there is clearly no obligation to perform consultation of upcoming policy proposals and regulations, and there seems to be also a little bit of reluctance on the government side to put in place a system in which, let's say, policies and regulations are disclosed in due time. Part of the reason is kind of the desire to retain the flexibility in terms of urgent or quick needs to be adopted. They think that this will block the procedures, and I must say that the good ranking of Georgia in doing business and the reforms, the initial thrust in the reforms, was very much a top-down approach. So I guess you know, there is some remains of that as well, that if you want to implement something, there is really no time for consultation. Sometimes there is no time, sometimes, you know, just there is no desire because of this lack of trust between the private sector and the government, but it is something which is very important and it needs to be tackled. Now, this already, like now mentioned in what I said right now, these are the main, let's say, issues where the public, where the government and the private sector comes into conflict, which is the kind of usual situation where the government thinks that all businesses are offenders, and where the private sector doesn't trust anyone from the government, and where the regulator or the government is inconsistent, and one day it's one rule, the other day, just after a week, it changes into something completely different. And there have been some examples here around that issue, with the visa requirements, with some other regulations which just were not consulted and had to be revisited because of this lack of proper consultation. Now, what I want to say really is that poor consultation ultimately results in bad regulation, which leads to a need to further review or reform. And this is absolutely the case. All countries that don't have a good system of consulting all stakeholders have this problem. Because it's just it's a kind of two-way process of getting the necessary information. And the government cannot have all the necessary information. Sometimes the government is a bureaucracy which kind of loses contact with the real world and what is happening in the real world. And what happens then is there is really no good perspective of kind of the real world. And even though government thinks they know best what the problem is and how to resolve it, that is not the case, and that is why consultations are very useful. Now, the usual problems that, even if you do consult, come up are, first of all, perceiving consultation as a process where you have to achieve consensus. And this I actually heard a lot during this week, that actually it's very difficult to obtain consensus, that's why reforms will be blocked, because it's not possible to reach consensus. This is not the case. This is a misconception. The consultation process is not about reaching consensus. The consultation process is about the government taking an informed decision, and the private sector, in this case, because we're talking about business environment, the private sector being informed, having a predictable business environment, and having the opportunity to have an input in the policy and regulatory process. So it's definitely not about, because all reforms have winners and losers, and somebody will lose, somebody will win. Ultimately, it's about the social benefit. So there has to be a political decision, and there has to be accountability for this political decision. So consultation is not about reaching consensus. Consulting only with interest groups, that's the second most common, let's say, pitfall. For example, I think that we have learned that there is an informal consultation process which is happening. Is it happen? Who is it? Why? There is no system. Who is invited, who is not, why? Are there any rules around that, or are only interest groups invited? And is there a capture of the regulatory process by the interest groups? And then performing only ex post consultation is also very frequent, which is the case when all the decisions have already been made, and consultation is only used as a ticking the box formality, and then you kind of throw the input into the garbage once it's finished. And this is really useless. Then it's better not to really waste resources on doing consultation if it is being done like that. So going back to the EU agenda, one of the things is that the EU has set some minimum standards for consultation, and as I said, transparency and consultation has been big on the EU agenda for a while now, even bigger so this year, and these are the minimum standards, which are quite simple and understandable. So you need to provide documents that are clear and understandable. You need to try to consult all relevant target groups. You need to kind of ensure sufficient publicity. You need to leave sufficient time for participation. So, publishing the draft law once the government has adopted it and before it goes to parliament is really not sufficient time for giving input. So the sooner the consultation process starts, the better for everyone. And then provide feedback. So whatever you do, whether you accept, you refuse, you need to provide some kind of collective or individual feedback. That's my little video. I wanted just to show a kind of, for regulatory reform, a high level of political support is really essential.
This is a landmark event in the life of this, and I hope, all future governments. It is our ambition to be one of the most transparent governments in the world, open about what we do, and crucially, about what we spend. And today, you're going to see just how transformative our plans really are. Starting from now, and updated each month, each government department will publish every item of spending over £25,000 online. Just think about what this could mean. People will be able to look at millions of items of government spending, flagging up waste when they see it, and that scrutiny is going to act as a powerful straitjacket on spending, saving us a lot of money. And from January, we'll also publish all the government contracts worth over £25,000. Every clause, every performance measure, every penalty trigger. This is going to make a huge difference to the deals we get and help us get real value for money for the taxpayer. These are just two of the changes we're making. There's plenty more, all of which you'll be discussing today. One of the most exciting is a new right to data, which will let people request streams of government information and use it for social or commercial purposes. Take all this together, and we really can make this one of the most open, accountable and transparent governments there is. Let me end by saying this. You're going to have so much information about what we do, how much of your money we spend doing it, and what the outcome is. So use it, exploit it, hold us to account. Together, we can set a great example of what a modern democracy ought to look like.
Yeah. So Mr. Cameron is obviously a great speaker. That's the first conclusion. But it tells you a little bit. I mean, there is no discussion here on regulation because this has been done a long time ago. So it's obvious that consultation happens at all stages, and you can see also that it's a two-way thing. So he says, use this information and hold us accountable. We're going to make everything available to you. Use it. So that's very, very also new, because last thing he said was about, let's say, having all data, government data, available for private or commercial purposes. Meaning that, for example, you could take the data set of the business registry and kind of analyze it. So it's really very, very new. And I would say the UK government is really kind of benchmark when it comes to transparency, also consultation, and they had a huge red tape reduction campaign, which was completely public. They were publishing laws by sectors and by areas in phases and kind of obtaining input as to what needs to be changed. So that's kind of the benchmark. But not only the UK, practically all countries are now very much focused on this agenda. Not only in Europe, but also I spent 3 years in Africa, and I can tell you that the transparency and consultation agenda is a huge agenda there as well, and businesses really insist on it, and it's just something that is absolutely necessary if you want to have a good business environment. Now, what I wanted to also mention, I don't want to talk about regulatory impact assessment because it's a whole new theme, and what I wanted to mention was also a consequence of our meetings here, because there seems to be a desire to do impact assessment there, and this has been discussed for a while now, since 2007, and there have been some pilot impact assessments. But what maybe kind of I didn't see is the awareness that a very important or essential part of regulatory impact assessment is called consultation. So I just wanted to put this slide, putting the steps of the process of regulatory impact assessment, which is also a process, not a document. A process that starts when you start thinking about the new policy, and which is useful from the perspective, as I said, not of sophisticated cost-benefit analysis, but of the, I would say, the perspective stop and think before you act, especially from the perspective of the civil service and bureaucracy. It's very easy to put out new rules, and it's almost a habit, like issuing new laws. It's the main task of the government, so it's become a habit to resolve every problem by issuing some kind of regulation. So I think impact assessment and having some kind of oversight watchdog body is giving the message to civil servants: stop and think before you do something. At least think about what the problem is you're trying to solve. If you can't define the problem, then nothing else will work. And if you can't define the problem properly, everything else will be wrong. It's like if you get on the wrong bus, every station will be the wrong station. So this is it. If you define the problem in the wrong way, nothing will be able to correct that. But the real point I wanted to make is that there doesn't seem to be an awareness that consultation is an essential part of RIA. So you hear, oh yes, we want to do RIA, but when it comes to consultation, it's not that straightforward. So just to sum up, the main points are that the title of the presentation, Beyond Doing Business, is that we need to kind of go beyond just ad hoc reforms that may make you look good in doing business, but do not maybe tackle some of the systemic issues, and look beyond that and kind of be aware of some of the systemic issues that need to be solved in terms of having a good business environment. The second point was about really sustainable reforms in this area. This is not a short-term reform where you will see results tomorrow. It's really a sustained effort, so that's why high-level political support is really essential, and kind of a sincere desire to actually implement these reforms. One thing which I didn't mention, maybe, it's not just about the rules, it's also about implementation of the rules, and what we have noted is that there is very often a high discrepancy between what is in the books and what is being implemented. This is something which we're trying to tackle and kind of figure out how to at least identify where these discrepancies exist and then try to deal with them. There is obviously a link between poor transparency and kind of unpredictability of the business environment, also corruption, of course. The fact, if you have a proper consultation process, you will significantly decrease the risk of unforeseen negative consequences and the kind of bad impression the government gives out when it enacts something and then has to go back and revise it after a couple of months. So this would be avoided. And then last one, which I already mentioned several times, there is no RIA process without proper consultation. So I will end my presentation here. I gave a couple of kind of questions for discussions, for the discussion, although of course it's kind of open floor for discussion, but I wanted to kind of hear from you as well, what do you think are currently the priority areas of reform when it comes to the business environment in Georgia? How do you evaluate some of the current activities in terms of setting up some kind of platform for public-private dialogue, such as the Investors' Council, which has been established, and some of the other activities? How can we make the public consultation and transparency part of the process in Georgia? Or let's say from informal and ad hoc and not systematized to a more kind of comprehensive, systematic approach. And I'm sure there are other issues for discussion as well. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So maybe part of it is just that they don't know what the effective consultation mechanism entails, and they're not properly trained in that, and there is no experience. So how does the World Bank or perhaps other bodies, international bodies, do to help the government with that, to overcome that problem?
I think that you're right. Every government is doing this in a different way, and of course the dynamics of the dialogue between governments and business is not static. It changes very much on the economic context. It depends on regional context. It depends on who's involved, personalities. So I think this is important to recognize. At the same time, I think there are some mechanisms that have been used in the region and internationally. And here I think one of the steps that we see as very positive is the creation of the Investor Council. This is something that the EBRD has sponsored. We have also been involved, and now the first meetings are going to take place this month. And so I think that's important because it's a forum which will bring together many of the major business associations, government, donors, and international financial institutions like the IFC and the EBRD, and it will really be focused on how to improve the investment climate. And so I think this is a mechanism that has been used in different countries around Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It's also been used in other regions, and it may be a good way to have a less charged dialogue and to focus more on the specific concrete actions that need to take place, including on the consultation process, but also on important policy issues, on investment policy, on other type of tax codes, labor codes, everything that affects SMEs and also larger companies.
I just want to add what the challenge is here. So we have also been working with governments to set up kind of feedback mechanisms using ICT tools, like feedback portals, or even like cell phone little surveys that go out to the users, and kind of try to figure out what's the most efficient way to collect feedback. Now, what the challenge is, and the platforms work quite well, I think, but then they're mostly focused on large businesses, really. When it comes to collecting input from small businesses, which are most affected by the unpredictability, and they bear the biggest cost because they don't have the capacity to deal with these changes, then it becomes very difficult. And I must say that we haven't had much success in kind of obtaining feedback from these category of businesses because they don't have the time, they don't have the capacity. They just, if you ask them, if the government asks them, what do you want from us? The usual answer is, we want you to leave us alone. So it's very difficult to get feedback from the small and micro businesses.
And maybe just before passing it on to the next question, I'd like to ask, how many people here have heard of doing business? So most, or almost everyone. How many people have heard of the Investor Council? Only a small minority. So I think this is important. I mean, I think the question is, to what extent do we start to see, as it starts to operate, that it really is having that kind of impact in terms of framing the policy questions and really leading to better decision-making process.
We talked about the fact that the previous reform effort by the previous administration of Georgia was very much top-down, and the results kind of are very good, impressive, and we are not heading, but very close to the top of the Doing Business rankings. There's a very big difference between what was done until 2007 and what is being done now. What has been done until 2007 was very much a deregulation effort. And if you remove the corrupt food safety inspector from the street, no one really bothers so much. We are all happy to not have that guy. Now we are in a regulation phase, where we are bringing back some of the regulations, hopefully in a good and smart way. And this is where consultations and transparency, I'm looking at a colleague here who knows exactly what I'm talking about, are very essential. And this which brings me to the following question. Just yesterday I had a meeting with an OECD expert on RIA, who is here with a mission to actually try and help implement a comprehensive RIA approach. The problem is that in some countries, such as Moldova, he gave me this example, RIA has been implemented kind of wall to wall. But what has happened as a result is that the quality of this RIA has been greatly compromised. I mean, they tick off the box on RIA, but no one really cares too much. I mean, they have to do it, and it has become almost a requirement, or it has become a requirement. But what is being actually done is not serious. So the issue here is how to implement RIA in a selective way, in a way that allows you to do it on crucial reforms, and which is about prioritization, I believe. But then, if you do it well, in a transparent way, engaging all key stakeholders in a slow way, not to go too fast, precisely because you don't want to make stupid mistakes and make yourself the target for everybody's criticism. So how do you do that?
Yeah. Thank you for that amazingly easy question. Actually, I was just in Moldova a couple of weeks ago, so so it's true. What you're saying is absolutely true. They have been really kind of consistently trying to implement RIA in the past, I don't know, 6-7 years, I would say, and it is mandatory. And there are a lot of the issues which you just mentioned. It's just a ticking the box exercise. They're now even splitting between policy impact assessment at the chancellery level and regulatory impact assessment. They call policy impact assessment ex ante evaluation, and then they have RIA administrative economy in 2 separate tracks, which I think is a disaster. But so to answer your question, now what I think is useful in terms of, let's say, overall screening, you're right, there has to be prioritization, but there also has to be screening, some kind of very basic screening. What I think is there has to be a basic screening of, let's say, business-related regulations. And that is not complex, and the RIA process is not complex, really. It's about those set of questions which anyone should be able to answer who is dealing with a problem. Even in your personal life, when you buy a car, you should be able to answer those questions. Like, you compare options, is this better, this is more cost effective. So it can be a very simple process. It doesn't require sophisticated analysis. So the very, very simple screening process brings 2 benefits, I think. The one I mentioned, stop and think, and then the second benefit is kind of damage control. I was heading a RIA unit for 4 years at the Prime Minister's office, so I have specific examples where we managed to prevent damaging provisions being enacted by the government by this simple screening, really, just going through the bill. Oh, you're adding some new license here or cost here, why are you doing this? Would it not be better here? So that's I think it could be fairly simple. The prioritization, you're right, some more serious RIAs should be done on really important regulations that have a significant impact. Now, how to define the threshold, that's the kind of question. In some countries, they have a kind of qualitative threshold. They say, let's say, relevant business, important business environment regulations, which is very vague, and then leads to the fact that ministries avoid doing it. And in some countries, they have quantitative. I don't know, if I take the US as an example, most of the RIAs are done by the Environmental Protection Agency and by the Food and Drugs Administration. And they have, like, in the EPA, 20 PhD economists do this. So they're very well equipped, and they still make mistakes. I mean, and that's why the private sector is very involved. And it happens that the EPA comes out with an impact assessment, and then the private sector hits back and says, "No, you're wrong. You totally miscalculated the costs," and then they have to go back. So it's a whole process, and they have set the threshold of $100 million. So everything which has foreseen impacts of over $100 million has to undergo a really serious kind of RIA process.
That would be equivalent of $1 million in Georgia.
So that's kind of that also has problems because it doesn't really, sometimes this monetary threshold doesn't really reflect the importance of the regulation. There could be other issues which are very relevant. So to be frank, I don't have an answer to your question. It really needs to be analyzed and weighed. But I think there are clear benefits of screening, like having a very simple screening for this damage control, and then focusing on the important ones for some more like substantive.
Okay. So in most countries, you have interest groups and lobby groups which are very interested to provide their input to the decision-making process because they want to influence it. On the other side, you have politicians who are very interested to hear what the interest groups say because they have more knowledge about the issues. So in most countries, I think, there will be a consultation between the government and the interest groups without any intervention, without any formalization. So why do you need a systemic consultation mechanism? Isn't it just adding bureaucracy to something which works already quite well?
You're right. For most of these issues, you can actually say, are you adding more bureaucracy? Even like regulatory impact assessment is definitely one of them. Because most countries do it, as you said, as a ticking the box exercise. At the end of the process, they've already taken the decision, they do some kind of RIA report at the end of the process. And that is really adding more bureaucracy to the process. And in that case, it really does not provide much more benefit to the whole process. It's the same with consultation. If it turns into a kind of ticking the box exercise, it really doesn't provide any value added to the process. I heard that there is a lobbying law in Georgia, but that it hasn't been really applied, and I'm not sure what the situation is in that respect. Informal consultations seem to be going on here in some way or the other, but I would say that at least initially you really need to set some rules to avoid the kind of discretionary ad hoc approach, which is also happening, where ministries decide whom they want to invite for this consultation and they just exclude others, and just to have some basic rules of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that I mean, the question for many of, as you described, in most reforms there are going to be some winners and some losers, but many of the reforms that we see in the pipeline or from the recent past, there is a very strong concentration on one of the two sides, of the cost or of the benefits, and the rest are more diffuse, right? So when you have this asymmetry, then you're going to have a very strong lobby group from the side on which the benefits are very concentrated or the costs are very concentrated, and on the other side, it may be all citizens who are somehow affected in a very small way by the reform, or all small businesses that don't really have the same level of representation. So I think what's important also in terms of this systematic approach is to bring on the table also some of these civil society or other business associations that can have a broader perspective than the interest groups that are directly affected.
Yes, I mean, regulations are basically about social benefits. I mean, ultimately they're supposed to produce producing higher costs, higher benefits than costs is ultimately about producing social benefits, not benefits for any of the affected parties separately.
Yeah. Hi, I have a question about and get back to the ease of doing business report. The question is, as you mentioned, it has been used as a very good PR tool by a lot of politicians across the world, and has been probably the favorite PR tool of our ex-president in terms of showing the economic openness of the country. But the question is, how good does it reflect what we've seen? It just can show you ease of starting a business, how easy it is to start a business and basically get, for example, a construction permit. But I think the the case for Georgia and for most of the developing countries in need of foreign direct investments is the question of ease of sustaining business and protection of ownership rights. That has been a big issue in the country in the past years. So if it becomes under question, the whole idea of the report, how does it reflect the actual reality? Because I myself, I'm responsible for direct investments for one of the companies in Georgia, and I can see that what is on the doing business report does not reflect the reality at all. And what I'm concerned about most of all is when I'm considering doing the investment appraisal is the question of having a predictability that the investment that my company will make will not be under question. So would you not as personally, but in general as a representative of the World Bank, would you question the whole point of having this type of report that does not really reflect the actual business environment?
I think it was not the aspiration of doing business to reflect a comprehensive picture of the business environment. It was the main objective was what it was, to kind of give a quick snapshot of issues relevant in the, let's say, indicators for which it measures certain, issues such as, the time and cost for the business to perform these procedures. So I think that was clear. Now, adding this complexity makes it a little bit more vague for me again personally, and there has been a lot of discussion around this, and there was a whole review of the doing business methodology in the past couple of years. There was an external working group that was engaged to look at the doing business and to see whether it makes sense or not. My personal opinion is that it has been extremely useful tool in terms of kind of fostering reforms, business environment reforms. I've used it a lot with the caveat and always kind of pointing out that really the doing business is not about giving you a systemic picture of all the issues in the business environment area or in the area covered by the indicator even. You mentioned starting a business, it just gives a quick snapshot of kind of how to register, how to start operating your business. It does not tell you anything about what happens afterwards and what are the procedures, even the procedures that kind of await you once you do register this business. And I don't think that was the ambition. And I think that simplicity was the main benefit of it. And I think it really, I find it, I don't question its existence from that perspective. I only think we should put more effort into making sure that when we do talk to our clients, that we explain, yes, doing business is a very nice proxy for kind of looking at the ease of doing business, but you really need to focus on systemic issues.
I would just say, in terms of the doing business, of course, it is a snapshot, and countries go up and down, right? Both in absolute and relative terms every year. So it's a moving sort of indicator, and I think what's more important is really to be able to have some of these positive changes, right, in terms of regulations and reductions in the cost and time of doing business, inserted into the law so that they then become fixed and continue to benefit future decisions. When you talk about future investment, that it's not something that is in some secondary bylaw, right? And then the next time there's a change in government or in a minister, that the bylaw will be revised overnight and the cost will change, in a way that nobody could predict. So I think that is very important. And we do that, in the course of our policy dialogue on this project, and the documents are all available online, so you can see the type of reforms that we're working on. We really want to make sure that the principles, long-term, are well established in the main legal framework, and that if there are some very specific numbers that guide some of these decisions, whether it's on insurance, solvency, margins, or whether we're talking about the coverage in terms of a future deposit insurance system, that these should be integrated into the legal framework and should provide a long-term anchor that allows businesses to make good decisions.
I think part of the problem is in the name of the index. I mean, if you called your index not doing business, but a quality of the regulatory environment index, you wouldn't have gotten as much, as many hits on your website. But the index would be reflecting, would be what it is. The name would be more consistent with what it is. At the moment, doing business sounds like it encompasses many more things that it doesn't. So that's part of the problem, I believe.
It is a sexy name.
Yeah,
that helps. And I think, if tacos in Mexico were called tacos de cebolla with tomate and blah, 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 maybe people would want to buy it because they sound a bit dangerous, or toxic. So I think, yes, it's one of the advantages has been it's a very simple framework. Not just a name, but a very simple framework.
I fully understand the motivation behind the name. One of the persons there's a Georgian guy who is involved in reforming Rwandan regulatory systems. There's an interesting Rwanda-Georgian connection, and the name is Ladogo Ugenidze, former prime minister. And he was once the chairman of my board. So he taught me one thing: don't the most dangerous thing you can do is to oversell and underdeliver. And part of it is about the name. Yeah. Taco is a great name, but it's also great great food.
I mean, I would just say that it is about the simplicity, I think, and that's both something that receives a lot of criticism, but also makes it an easy tool to understand. It's a framework which is really very, very simple in some ways. It touches or is kind of well connected to some economic theories. So in that respect, it's easy for economists also to understand how it relates to their own education. And the way that it is carried out in terms of surveys going directly to the business community, to lawyers who work on this, is a very simple methodology. So this is both an advantage and a disadvantage. But I think it's what's made it quite a powerful tool, as Andrea said, in terms of just focusing attention on certain aspects that people knew weren't working very well. And now it's clear when you compare it at the international level that they're not working very well. Now, once you get into the specific area, whether it's construction permits or access to finance, the devil is in the details, and one has to go much deeper in terms of the assessments and diagnostics.
The governments, I guess, they mainly operate in this election cycle, and if some indicator is good for, showing to people that you have done something, then it's great, and you have a prime minister calling and complaining and trying to do something. But with these more long-term and more complex reforms, I guess it's not as sketchy, and perhaps for the government there's less incentive to do them because they cannot show to their constituents what they've done. So my question is it something that you deal with, and how do you see that in your everyday practice?
Easy way is to come and look at the doing business indicators, but we do try to focus more their attention to systemic issues around areas which we are dealing with, and we also have a big, trend in the World Bank group to provide kind of comprehensive solutions, not like ad hoc reforms. So also within our organizations, we're thinking a lot how to connect the various departments and how to provide comprehensive solutions. And recently we had kind of interviewed some of the country directors, and that was what they said. We don't want you to come with ad hoc kind of reforms. We really want to see a kind of comprehensive solution around one area. So that's the message which we're trying to give to our clients as well. And I think that's the trend. It's obviously difficult to get their attention on the systemic issues because of what you just said. And it's something which I don't have a clear answer for.
Well, doing business is the flagship report in this area, but when the World Bank is discussing how it will frame its partnership for the next few years, what it's using nowadays is something called a systematic country diagnostic, And this is a very, very different type of approach, which combines, as Andrea said, the resources and analytic capacity, both internally and externally to the bank, to come to some prioritization of policies, not just on business environment, but also health, education, infrastructure, and so on. And so I think that is really now the most important analytic tool that we have at the country level. And then there are others, of course, underneath it. In terms of the policies, you will see, and if you browse through the document for our budget support, that we do not have any policies from the doing business agenda. And the reason for that is that Georgia, in many respects, was more advanced than many other countries around, and that what we wanted to focus on was on what we were calling second-generation business environment reforms, like the ones Andrea is talking about, on public-private dialogue, support for entrepreneurship, how to advance the public procurement system even further, competition policy. And so the focus for us in this is on policies that are a bit harder to put in place and to implement and to monitor, but which could have a bigger impact in the long term.
I think I just want to add there is, let's say, a big role for the private sector also to play here, and that's something which maybe we could do more in terms of trying to make sure that the private sector, what your colleague mentioned, has the capacity to participate in a meaningful way. And kind of there is this whole area of the private sector and the NGOs and civil society putting pressure on the government to let's say, deliver on more systemic reforms.
Just to finalize, to thank everybody for staying so long, but we do hope that this will just be the first of maybe several sessions, and to bring to you also and kind of get your feedback on some of the specific areas where we're working, not just on business environment, also on financial sector, on pensions, on innovation, where there are major reform efforts going on, some faster, some slower, and I think it would be useful for us to provide you also with our own views on how these reforms should be moving forward, and then try to bring also other people who could inform this type of debate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.